Hello, I'm going to get my screen shared right away because I have a PowerPoint. Naturally enough, can't talk about walking around Rome without showing pictures of Rome. All right, so I'm going to get this all done up and then I am ready. So this paper, I plan to probably talk for about 40 minutes. I'm thinking we're going to do 15 minutes of walls, 15 minutes of roads, and then 15 or 10-ish minutes of how does this relate to the research project I just teased there in the introduction, which is about Cicero. So first of all, we have a slide here, walls and roads, walking around through Rome, which shows both some walls and a road in Rome. But it's not actually these walls that I'm going to be talking about. These are the Aurelian walls, which are some later ancient walls. And they're not the walls that I was interested in walking around. So basically where this comes from is that in 2018, I went to Rome for research and conference related reasons. And while I was there, I really wanted to kind of get a better sense of the physical space of Rome. I wanted to understand where things are in relationship to each other. How big was was ancient Rome? How could what could you see from one place to another place? How would you get from one place to another? And what I decided to do was to kind of take two different approaches to gaining this really broad sense of the space of the city, or at least it can be reconstructed now, by walking the approximate circuit of the Serbian walls of Rome, more on what those are in a moment, and then walking from the city center out on the Via Appia. One of the results of these walks was that I did end up kind of hatching this idea for a new research project on Cicero and space and place and how this relates to masculinity as it is portrayed in Cicero's work. That's the last thing, which I'll get to at the end. First, though, the Serbian walls. So the big impressive gates that were on the first slide, those are not the Serbian walls. The Serbian walls were Rome's first big stone walls. They were legendarily built by Servius Tullius, who was the 6th king of Rome. His traditional dates are 575 to 535 BCE. They probably were not built by King Servius Tullius. They were probably actually built sometime in the earliest 4th century BCE, probably after the capture of Veii in 396 and the Gallic sack of Rome in 390. I believe they are at least partially built of stone that comes from the territory of Veii. So it kind of makes sense that, after Rome had got that territory, they had the stone. And then after they had had this terrible, terrible trauma of the city being sacked by the Gauls, they went, okay, now we need to build some big city walls. So that's kind of the reasoning for these dates. The Serbian walls have almost completely disappeared from sight. There's a variety of reasons for this. Probably first and foremost is that even before the end of the Roman Republic, so we're talking, more than 2,000 years ago, they had already become defensively unimportant because the city had outgrown them massively. So they were no longer actually protecting the city as early as 2,000 years ago. And then they were actually replaced by the Aurelian Walls, and that's what the picture on the first slide was, which are still mostly standing. And the Aurelian Walls encompassed a much broader, a much larger area, and so they actually did protect the city. So the Serbian Walls really weren't useful anymore after the Aurelian Walls were built. The walls have also disappeared because their stone has been robbed throughout the ancient, medieval, and Renaissance period. It is entirely possible that all of the stone that once made up the Serbian walls is still in Rome. It's just not in the walls anymore. It's, you know, in the foundations of buildings that were near the walls. Because, you know, why would you go out and quarry new stone when you have a giant but now useless city wall worth of stone just sitting there that you could take and use for buildings that you actually need? So they're mostly disappeared. As you can imagine, this made deciding to walk around the circuit challenging. The circuit has been reconstructed. There are various kind of more or less theoretical reconstructions of where the walls were. There are some pieces. A lot of the gates are missing and it's not entirely certain where they are, but there are some pieces. So you can kind of create this sort of circuit through modern Rome around where the pieces are. So basically I had a guidebook, the Blue Guide to Rome, that told me where some of the pieces were. There was also a very helpful blog that had pictures and kind of locations for various other pieces. And so I just took Google Maps and I mapped out where all the pieces were and I walked to each of them. The actual circuit of the walls is different and doesn't necessarily follow modern roads, but I mean, it's hard to fully reconstruct it anyway. So I kind of just took what seemed to me like the most sensible route to go around these different walls. And it was a very interesting experience because it took me, I mean, it started off in places where I had been before, near the Roman Forum, near the Capitoline, but then it took me into parts of Rome that I hadn't really gone to before. I hadn't really thought of as being part of ancient Rome. I mean, they're part of modern Rome, but it did kind of give me a much better sense of what the extent of Rome was, even very early on in its history. So the first piece is maybe somewhere around the Capitoline. It's possible that these bits you can see kind of in the picture on the right, or on the left, sorry, might have something to do with the walls. This picture on the right, for a long time people thought it might be a gate in the Serbian walls, but it's probably not. It's probably a later portico. So these are kind of the first maybe pieces of walls. The one on the left, which looks very unimpressive, is much more representative of what we're going to be seeing for wall pieces for the rest of the time. The one on the right, of course, is probably not actually part of the Serbian walls. So one starts, though, in a familiar part of Rome near the Capitoline Hill. That's where this is. And then you start on your adventure. So you're walking through Rome. You're starting at the foot of the Capitoline. The back of the portico, again, might have some bits of walls in it. And then you just kind of walk past the Capitoline Hill, past the markets of Trajan, start heading up a hill, and find your first piece of wall that is definitely Serbian wall, which you can get nowhere near because it is in a traffic circle. It's just really emblematic of how modern Rome is built around these ancient pieces. So these, on the picture on the right there, these like kind of grayish brown lumps of stone in the middle of a traffic circle on a busy street, those are pieces of the Serbian wall. It was also interesting to do this project because it does make you kind of seek out Roman ruins that are not part of the usual suspects, the big ticket, fancy, famous stuff. Instead, going and looking at these kind of humble bits of stone. Another thing you get to experience when you're looking for the pieces of the Roman walls is, again, like how the city has just continued moving on. So I continue on past the I think at this point I was on the Esquiline Hill, and I found my next pieces of walls. Here they are. They are behind some garbage bins built into, and kind of a later building has been built around them. These are actually probably the third biggest chunk of wall that still remains of the Serbian wall. You can see it's a similar kind of stone to what we saw on the last slide, but there it is behind the garbage bins. Not a very famous monument, not a famous monument, not something that lots of tourists are going to look at. My next chunk of wall, and we're kind of continuing my circuit, was near Termini railway station. This is probably the most famous piece of Roman wall, of Serbian wall. It's definitely the largest piece, and it has its own kind of history of preservation, where the main railway station was built to kind of include it as part of the station. When Termini Station, as it currently exists, was first built, there was actually a viewing space where, I think it's a store now, but there was a viewing space where you could go and you could observe the wonders and the mist and the magic of the ancient Rome from the modern Rome. So the walls, at least the piece at Termini Station, are kind of part of this blending of the ancient and modern into the landscape that we see in Rome. So at this point, I was probably about halfway through my walk. My walk in total, I think, was around 7 or 8 kilometers. And this brought me to one of the more interesting pieces of the Roman wall that I found, which was in Piazza Manfredo Fanti, near the long-closed Roman Aquarium. Why is this interesting to me? First, it's interesting because, so in the picture on the left, there are, as you can see, lumps of masonry and some bricks and stuff. And this is a really good example of what I was saying about like how the later city had absorbed the Serbian walls, because in the foreground, those are later buildings that were built up against the Serbian wall, using it as a firm kind of back wall for later houses. And so, yeah, and it's interesting again, because these are these very non-famous, non-visited monuments. This piece of the wall is in a park, but there's not really any signage much about what it is. It's certainly not, hey, come see this piece of the Serbian wall. At least when I was there, roughly half of the park was actually unaccessible. There was no sign or wall telling you couldn't go into it, but if you tried to go into the half of the park behind where the wall is, a guard at the park would come and yell at you and tell you to not go in the place that there was no indication you shouldn't go. So again, kind of like this weird semi-monument. They're preserved, they're there, but they don't really attract a lot of attention because I think most people aren't necessarily interested in tracing these kind of fragments of earlier walls when there's a big fancy wall to look out further out. And we can see this again by how they are just tucked into the cityscape. So here's the next 2 pieces of wall. There's what's called the Arch of Gallianus, which might be one of the city gates from the Serbian wall. And it's just kind of tucked in the back between 2 buildings. The Auditorium of Mycenas has a chunk of the Serbian wall in it. And I put a big heart there because I love Mycenas. All just absorbed into later buildings. You know, these are churches that have absorbed the arch. The Auditorium of Mycenas was originally probably about 1st century BCE. It's absorbed pieces of the walls. That was interesting to me in my interest in kind of learning about the base of the city, because I knew that parts of the city, especially the Esquiline Hill, had they were garden space. They were almost suburban. And just seeing this like being quite literally suburban, it's outside of the walls. The walls are incorporated into the buildings leading into these garden spaces, really helped to give me a sense of how almost like pseudo pastoral and remote these spaces within the city must have felt. So I was successfully learning about the city as I wished to. And then I've got a couple other pieces of gates. This one might be the Porta Capana, this arch here. which was built into later imperial buildings. Again, we're seeing them absorbed by the later buildings. By the time I was nearing the end of my wall walk, it had started to rain, and that's why this picture is so misty. So you will have to trust me that this lump in the middle, covered by trees, that is the remains of the Porta Capana, which was the gate in the Serbian walls that led to the Via Appia, which we're going to get to in a moment. It's also completely inaccessible. It's like in a median in the middle of a busy road. And then finally, the final wall pieces are in the Aventine. These were the wall, other than the Termini wall pieces, these were the only ones that I had seen before and that I knew exactly where they were. They, as you can see, are quite large and impressive pieces that are currently perhaps undergoing restoration based on the fencing around them, or maybe just being protected. They also show signs of later use with this little arch thing here in the one on the lower right, which is like some kind, not a gun emplacement, but like something like a gun emplacement, a gun loop. Yeah, so the walls. What would be my conclusion about the walls? From walking this route of the walls, I really learned that first, that Rome was both bigger and smaller than I'd expected it to be. I had allocated an entire day to doing the wall walk. It ended up only taking, I think, 5 hours, and that included a stop for lunch. So, I mean, learning that I could actually walk completely around at least 4th century Rome in 5 hours, that gave me a really good sense of the size. I mean, if we think of kind of later Augustan Rome and the population figure of, oh, there's 1 million people, it kind of gives this idea of a big city. Modern Rome is a very big city, but ancient Rome, it's a 5-hour walk around the circuit, and it wasn't even 5 hours. That's not a very big place. And this helped with my kind of general interest in understanding the city to really connect the space with this idea that Rome was such a face-to-face society. I mean, that everybody kind of seems to have known everybody's business, and that there wasn't a lot of hiding, and life was lived very publicly. And getting this sense of Rome as, you know, not actually being that big was really useful. The other thing that I really got out of this walk, and for which I would really recommend it, is a sense of where things are in connection with each other. A sense of, okay, if I'm on, you know, I knew where the Capitoline Hill was, I knew where the Palatine Hill, and I knew where the Aventine was. But actually getting a sense of like, okay, where's the Caeline again? Where's the Esquiline? How would I get from one hill to another? How long would it take to get from one place to another on foot? The streets are not the same anymore. That's certainly unquestionable. But you can still kind of get a sense of the kind of amount of time it would take to get from one place to another. Yeah, I think those were the kind of the two biggest takeaways from the wall walk. That, and just seeing the way that it had been absorbed into the city, and how little there is left of things that are that old, which was also something I sort of knew from my time with the American Academy Summer School, where we definitely saw that a lot of the impressive big Roman things, Roman monuments that you think of now, the Colosseum, the buildings in the Forum, the Imperial Fora, those are relatively late in the Roman story. Those are imperial monuments. Even the Senate House, that's not the Senate House that Julius Caesar built. They're all later. And the further back you try to go, the harder it is to even figure out where something physically was. And just this complicatedness of like thinking of Rome as a city that is like, of all cities, it's quite well documented. It's been studied for a really long time. But even so, there are all these things that are just lost. And kind of connecting that to Roman literature and how Roman literature, that's so much stuff is just lost. The city and the literature are the same. There are like just little bits and pieces sticking out that you can grab. All right, so that's my wall. I think that's enough on the walls, and I will now move on to the road, which is the Via Appia, is the road that I walked. The Via Appia, the Appian Way, was first constructed in 312 BCE by Appius Claudius Caecus. I'm just going to take a sip of tea because I'm used to asking people if they have questions and stopping talking for a second. All right, so Via Appia. It was first constructed, yes, by this fellow called Appius Claudius Caecus. It originally connected Rome to the city of Capua to the south, and its original purpose was for troop movement. So it is long and straight and good for moving people quickly at that time. According to Wikipedia, to this day, it is the longest stretch of straight road in Europe. So I thought that was a fun fact. Yeah, 62 kilometers. Yep, straight road. Pretty impressive for a road that was built 2,300 years ago. It started at the Porta Capana, that lump of stone with a bunch of trees on top of it, in the Serbian Walls. So we have this connection here. Although later on, it actually started from the Porta San Sebastiano in the Aurelian Walls. So when the new walls were built, we have a new start for this road. All right, so for the walk on the Via Appia, this was on Sunday, June 24th, 2018. And I had devoted the whole day, and I had packed a lunch, and I knew that my plan was simply to start at my Airbnb in Trastevere and walk until I got tired of walking. I ended up walking 16.7 kilometers, which I thought was pretty good for a hot day in June in Italy. I was very excited about this walk because I knew that it would take me out into parts of Rome that I had visited before, but that it would also take me through areas I had not visited before. It also, as I expected, gave me a really good sense of like how far do you have to go out of Rome, out of ancient Rome, before you get to the countryside, and gave me a sense of what it was like to travel by foot on this road. As I say on the slide here, I did walk 16.7 kilometers, but that wasn't technically all in the Via Appia because I started about 2 kilometers from the Porta Capana. And I had to cross the Tiber and walk through the Circus Maximus before I started on the Via Appia. Also, some of my 16.7 kilometers was kind of wandering around in a park, more on that later. There is a park called the Parco Regionale del Appia Antica, and it is great. It is a park that is centered on the ancient road and all of the monuments and buildings and tombs and such that are around it. Parts of the Via Appia Antica, the ancient road, are closed to traffic on Sundays. Should you happen to be in Rome with a day to spare, I highly recommend going on a Sunday trip to the Via Appia. You can rent a bike and you can just ride and ride. And as I said, they do close the road to traffic, so it feels really awesome and like you're being an ancient Roman. All right, so my actual start of this road is Porta Capana, this unobtrusive looking lump of stone that was once the gate of the Serbian Walls. At the beginning, the Via Appia is a road. Yeah, a road. Before you even get to the next gate, which is the main gate at San Sebastiano, you start to see evidence of the ancient uses of the space outside the walls and the space alongside of roads. So we started, I'll go back here. As I said, we start here at this gate, which means that from this point on this road, you were outside of the ancient city walls, which means that along the Via Appia, there would have been many, many tombs. Many of you probably already know that Romans didn't bury their dead inside the city walls. and that instead often the roads along the roads leading out of the town would be lined with tombs, with often the most elaborate and prominent tombs being right up against the road, and less elaborate, less high status ones being further away. And this is how I ended up walking past the tomb of the Scipios, which I didn't even know where it was. I mean, I knew it existed. I'd seen the inscriptions in the Vatican Museum. I'd never actually been to the tomb of the Scipios. I still haven't, but now I know where it is. For this, again, getting back to that main point of knowing where things are. I would not have been able to tell you where the tomb of the Scipios was, but now I've got that in my mental map. Like, okay, I know where this is. I know how to get to it. It's mostly closed. I think you can only get in with an appointment. So I just took this picture, sadly, longingly, from the grate at the gate. Although you can kind of see there's like a sort of light. There's a light back there. Very mysterious. So yeah, the tomb of the Scipios is there. You walk along, keep on going. There's some kind of arch. It is the Arch of Drusis is what it is conventionally called, except maybe it's Trajan's or Caracalla's. It's the Arch of somebody. So there's this very impressive looking arch. It is just inside the Aurelian Walls, but was not incorporated into them, which is interesting, because when the Aurelian Walls were built, that larger circuit of walls, they were built in a bit of a hurry, and they incorporated material from a lot of pre-existing structures. So I thought it was interesting, and I don't know why, but I thought it was interesting that this arch, which is really right behind the Aurelian Walls, I'm taking the picture from inside of the gatehouse of the Aurelian Walls, was just kind of left there. While I'm giving my recommendations, this is the Porta San Sebastiano, the gate of the Aurelian Walls there. Well, I'm giving recommendations for things to do on your day out in Rome. Inside this gatehouse, there is the Museum of the Walls. It is free. It is not super huge, and it doesn't have that much in it, but it kind of doesn't need to, because when you go in, you get to go into the gatehouse. You get to go all the way up to the top. You can even go up on the roof and look out from under it, look out from the top of the roof. And most awesomely, you can actually walk along the Aurelian Walls for, I would say, about a few hundred meters until they get to rough and you can't go in them. So you can walk along the Aurelian Walls. You can look up into the little guard posts. There's evidence for the rapid erection of the walls in the form of things like some of the flooring is made of old tombstones, because there were a lot of tombs around the wall, around the roads. They're building the walls in a hurry. Tombstones that are, from graves that nobody's tended for 100 years. They just kind of grabbed that stone and incorporated it into the walls, which I guess goes back to my previous point in the Serbian Walls thing, where you can just see this constant use and reuse, and the newer cities absorbing the older cities. Yeah, so highly recommend the Museum of the Walls. Oh, yeah, I spoke too soon. I had pictures from the inside. So this is what you can walk in. This is what it looks like. So if we go back to this one, you can see there's, here, these are the walls. This is what it looks like inside. And you can just kind of walk inside of the walls. There's these little kind of guard towers that are smaller than the gate towers periodically along the walls. One of them has got a medieval fresco of the Virgin, I think. And it seems like it might have been used by a hermit at some point, because during the Middle Ages, huge amounts of Rome were abandoned, and the Aurelian Walls were basically on the outskirts in the middle of nowhere. And so at some point, a hermit took one of the guard towers for his own, and there was a painting of the Virgin Mary made either while he was there or later to commemorate him. So there's all these kind of neat historical details and the layering of history that is so Rome in the Aurelian, in this museum. And this is taken from the roof of the gate. This is what it looks like outside the Aurelian Walls. Lots of trees. That's because there's a great big park out there, which is amazing because a lot of the area outside of Rome has been built up over the past 100, 150 years. But here, some of it has been preserved, and so you do get this better sense of the ancient world. I said that the Aurelian Walls eventually became the place where the Via Appia officially started, and this is the first milestone of the Via Appia. It's a reproduction. The original one is in a museum. I cannot remember which one right now. But yeah, so here is the official first milestone of the Via Appia, currently built into the wall of a house or business. All right, so things get pretty amazing when you leave the Aurelian Walls, because I'm actually just going to go back to this picture. So you walk along this road, and you're in between some modern walls and buildings, and it's hot, and you're tired, and you're like, I was promised a park. Where is the park? Because all you can see is buildings and road. I turned down a road, which promised me that the park was that way. But I walked for like 5 minutes and it was still just like walls on either side and hot and blah. And then I heard a rooster, and then I went around the corner, and what did I see but a farmyard with goats and ducks. And that was my first indication that I had entered the part of the Via Appia where it's sort of like this pastoral landscape where you feel like you've wandered into Virgil's Georgics. I don't have a picture of it, but like around the next bend in the road, there was this kind of, it opened out into a meadow, and there was a flock of sheep. And not what I was really expecting to see, given that we are still very much in the like, I was going to say the Greater Toronto area, the Greater Rome area. We're still very much within the city. So it's really awesome because somebody had the foresight to put aside a bunch of land to let us keep, to let people continue to have this feeling of what the outskirts of Rome were like up to, not that long ago, up till the 19th century. More tombs, again, like lots of very large, impressive tombs in the Via Appia Park. This one I wanted to highlight specifically because, again, another modern touch. They've actually installed accessible signage at some of the sites in Rome. So this has got a description, this white stuff is a description of the tomb, and then below it, there's the description in Braille, and then all of the other things on this table thing on the right are like 3D touchable models of what the architecture of the tomb, so that you can just feel out what the patterns were, which I thought was incredibly cool. And as I said, park. So you move into this landscape where there is just grass, there's fields, there's trees. This very it doesn't feel like modern Rome. It really feels like you're kind of experiencing what it was like to travel through the countryside, not very far away from Rome in ancient times. More parko. At that point, I had kind of swerved off the main route of the Via Appia to go into the fields, and then returned at the Tomb of Kaikilimatella, which is another kind of major landmark on the Via Appia, which I had been to before. So at this point, I was in familiar territory. But when I'd been to the Tomb of Kaikilimatella before, I had arrived on a bus. So kind of getting back to that idea of getting sense of what the space is and what distances were. I now had that. I now have where this tomb is in my mental map. I now have where the other tombs around it are. And it's so useful for really, there are things you can't understand just by looking at a picture or looking at a map. Whereas if you actually do the kind of, I'm going to walk to this space, I'm going to understand this space. It was just, it made things click into place, and it made associations click into space that I didn't have before. This is the road closed to vehicular traffic. And then this is my last, this is my last Via Appia picture. Eventually, as I said, you do kind of keep going, and eventually you come to a piece of the ancient pavement, which is, I guess, a really great way to kind of feel that physical connection to ancient Rome, walking on this road that has been there for, well, I'm sure it's had repairs, but has in theory been there for about 2,300 years. The people who have rented bikes, though, they use this path beside it because it turns out ancient roads aren't very nice to bike on. All right, so that's my road adventure. I learned that I, a modern North American, probably can't walk as far as an average Roman, because I'm pretty sure that the Romans would go a lot further in one day than I did. I wasn't terribly surprised by that, though. But really, there was that sense of space, of just like how far before you got out of town. This is outside of ancient Rome. If it had been ancient times, I would have been well past the built-up city area long before I got to this section of the road. I was in an area where it was, there were suburban villas, there were tombs, and just to kind of reiterating the sense I'd got from the walls that the ancient city was just, it was dense, it was focused, it was not that big. And that kind of relating that to what I knew about Roman society. All right, so now we come to the last part of this paper, and I think I'm staying roughly on the timings that I had promised. And that is my Cicero project. So I'm going to kind of give you a project proposal version of what this project is and how it relates to this walking and thinking. I'm also going to tell you what all these pictures are that are on them, because most of the pictures that I have on the Cicero Project slides are not going to be terribly obvious. The picture on this slide is the remains of the Aura Maxima, an altar dedicated to Hercules. That was in, the remains are in the church whose name I cannot remember, but it's the church with the Bocca della Verita, the big face you stick your hand in, and if you're telling the truth, it won't bite you. That one. This is like 8 blocks of stone in the basement of a church that was once a major altar to Hercules that was restored and honored by the Emperor Augustus, but had existed since the earliest times of Rome. So the Cicero Project, getting back to that, I am interested in the way that Roman masculinities intersect with places in the city of Rome, as portrayed by Cicero, the politician, orator, and philosopher who lived in Rome in the 1st century BCE. Cicero is a really interesting person whose work to kind of look at for these purposes, partly because he's unique among the ancient Romans and rare among people in general before the early modern era, in that we have a really well-rounded, or a relatively well-rounded picture of him as a person rather than only a historical figure. And that's because of the volume and variety of written works that he produced and that happened to survive into the present day. We have his speeches, both political ones and legal ones, but we also have handbooks he wrote on oratory, works of philosophy, poetry, and many of his personal letters. And all of these different works give us views of different sides of him. We get to see different levels of Cicero. And more importantly for my project, they let us see his society, including the people and places he knew, from multiple angles. They let us see, they help us to excavate these people and places and attitudes that are long buried under later things. So this slide includes a picture that is part of the structure of the Basilica Aemilia, a Roman basilica, which is like a largish public building that was on the side of the Roman Forum. And this particular piece of it, these stones we can see here, might be from the version of it that existed in Cicero's time. They're low enough that they might be. So the Cicero topic for this slide, Cicero and gender studies. Cicero's works are really often used as a source of information on gender roles or social relations in first century BCE Rome. But nobody has yet kind of taken them as a whole as an object of study for Cicero's conception of masculinity. Roman masculinity is a particular interest of mine. I'm interested in the different ways that gender works for Roman men and the different kinds of masculinity that were available to them. So I have selected one facet of Cicero's world, this relationship of masculine gender and place. Because Cicero definitely uses places in the city of Rome to construct and undermine people's gender roles and identities. One of the most famous examples of this is in his speech, the Pro Caelio, which I'm sure at least some of you have read, where he uses the kind, he's attacking a woman, and one of the ways he attacks her is, so women were supposed to primarily live and work out of their homes, but their homes, he's attacking this woman, and as part of attacking her, he attacks her home, because if he makes her home seem like a place of ill repute, because it's a place that's associated with her, he's making her be a person of ill repute by tainting her home. He taints her. And I think he's doing the same thing with men's gender as well. I will probably I'm going to start places that are where I feel like it's likely to be very obvious, like when he's attacking Antony, or when he's attacking Catiline, his kind of major enemies. Yeah, so this is, I'm curious about how places interact with gender, both to construct and to undermine gender identities. Gender and place is the title of this next slide. The picture on this slide is from the Republican era House of the Griffin on the Palatine, which is, I don't know, 15 feet, maybe more underground at this point. That is the famous griffin that gives it its name. So gender and place. The spaces where a person carried out their activities or simply existed told people important information about their status. That means that space operated in a way that we can also see today, where certain places will have stereotypical associations with different categories of people. So in a stereotypical sense, we would probably associate places like spas and salons more with women. We might associate places like daycares more with women if we're being very stereotypical. We might associate places like hardware stores or garages or cigar bars stereotypically with men. Roman places also had these gendered associations, except that the ancient associations were much stronger, I would argue, than the modern ones, and more likely to be governed by custom or even law that said only certain genders or statuses of people were allowed to be in a place. Being in a very strongly gendered space said something about a person's willingness or ability to conform to or challenge societal norms with respect to gender. And as is still true now, places could also suggest information about a person's status, their place in the life cycle, or other identities. So there's definitely a connection between place and gender. The picture on this slide is of the foundations of the Temple of Jupiter Optimus Maximus, which are underneath the Capitoline museums. Many places in the 1st century BCE Rome had general gendered meanings and associations. Public spaces were more likely to be considered masculine. Private spaces were more likely to be considered feminine, but that sense could change depending on the time of day, the activity that was happening, the occasion, or even who was present. So my project is going to begin by testing the theory that there are some parts of the city that are always manly and upright, some that are always kind of morally or genderly suspect, but others that are more open to interpretation. I'm going to investigate what places fall into each category and what kinds of interpretations can be brought to bear on them in what circumstances. I'm going to start with some obvious gendered spaces, such as the Forum, the political heart of Rome, as a place of masculine public activity, or the house as a place of individual or family identity, and then move on from there, following where the evidence takes me. So I think this is my last slide. Walls, roads, and Cicero. This particular picture is taken from a museum called the Cryptobaldi Museum, and it shows the many levels of building that have happened on this spot over the course of thousands of years. It started as a theater that was built not in Cicero's time, but not long after. And then kind of goes up and up and up and up from there. So back in 2018, I started off wanting to know more about the physical space of Rome. I knew that Roman literature was very situated in the city. There's lots of references to places in the city. Places in the city have meaning. And I wanted to know more about that physical space as much as can be reconstructed based on many rebuildings and changes. And at that time, I had a vague idea that I was going to do a Cicero project eventually. The two of them came together, and I'm planning, hopefully this summer, maybe next summer, to walk out some of Cicero's routes, find some of the places he talks about, and create a mental map of places and space in Cicero's Rome. That is that. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Melanie, for that talk. I see we have a question already. It's certainly something I think you highlighted really well throughout the whole thing is this, the importance of kind of experiential learning of the space, getting out into spaces. And that's, it's not something just for people who are working on kind of, at least in classical studies on archaeology or this kind of stuff, but really that literature and culture are integrated into space. And I especially liked your sort of thought that, in a way, all of Latin literature and Rome's fragmentary material remains can be kind of integrated, right? That this is all fragments of Roman civilization. Even those whole parts of it we have, like the Aeneid, are really fragments because we don't have a full place to kind of situate them in. So I thought that was a really insightful way of thinking about space and literature in that way. I did want to ask a question, and it's going right back to the beginning of your talk, because it occurred to me as soon as you started speaking about the walls. Before I go on, I should remind our audience, if you'd like to ask a question, there's a Q&A button at the bottom. I see a couple people have already put on questions. You can use the chat as well, and we'll come to them in just a moment. So I just wondered about this the Serbian walls, and you mentioned to us that they're sort of traditionally associated with Servius Tullius in 575 BCE, traditional dates or something like that, but they're actually from the 4th century. And I wondered if you could maybe touch on or expand for our audience on why would the Romans themselves throw them back in time? Why would they want to place the walls further back in time than their perhaps historical reality? If you have some thoughts on it.
Now I'm like, I didn't look that up before I gave this talk. I probably knew this at some point. So I'm gonna make some plausible suggestions based on what I know about how the Romans think about things. Romans, they're really into like everything old is better. So if they could put something back far away in time and then attach it to some important historical figure. And Servius Tullius was like a relatively good king of Rome. He was the one before the one that ended the kings. So I suspect part of it is just that like, it's very ancient. It's probably Servius Tullius, that's who made it. They also could have been reacting to a tradition that existed in later Roman history. Pardon me.
Sure.
If somebody else has better information than I do off the top of my head on why they were associated with Servius Tullius, I would be happy to be told.
Well, it sounds plausible and correct to me as well. So that's thank you very much. Well, I think Ruth, unless you want to turn with the question, or do you want to turn to the Q&A from the audience?
Well, I was just going to ask Melanie, when you plan to walk around this Cicero route and create a mental map, would you consider, or are you considering sort of like a webcam with you to sort of follow your path so that you're actually making a more virtual something later that students can maybe look at or log into, and you can share it, you know, more expansive, especially with this experimental learning. You know, it's another avenue. So your thoughts as you're going, or just these different angles that you might see, like, would you consider something like that on your journey?
I had not thought about that, but I love that idea. I had thought about using, like, you can get those apps that like track your route when you run and stuff. So I was thinking I would get one of those. So at least I'd be able to see where I'd been and like show on a map, yeah, this is the route that I took. But I love the idea of using like a GoPro or something so I can just be like recording the whole journey. That's amazing. Thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome.
And I think it absolutely would be great for like making it kind of a potentially a learning, a teaching tool.
Exactly. Yeah, that'd be great. That's all I wanted to ask right now, Peter. I have lots more. You've inspired me to want to go there, but I have more, but we'll open it up.
I'm an evangelist for the Via Appia Antica Park. I'm like, yeah, go. It's great.
Well, I'll say to our audience members who aren't in Winnipeg, there's also a reason any of us in Winnipeg would want to go to Rome today. It's about -36 here and has been since Christmas, as far as I'm concerned. So, the pictures of a warm Italy were certainly welcome. I've closed my blinds and just imagine that's where I am. Our first question in the Q&A is from Moti Lieberman, and they write, you talked about how there were places that used to show off these walls, but no longer, like at the train station, and the pieces of these walls that are still there are unremarked upon and unavailable to access. And I might add, also, or surrounded by garbage cans in some cases, right? Why do you think these are being ignored? What's the deal with the situating of these modern bits of the Serbian walls?
So the train station one, I'm just going to save that for a second and come back to the other ones. I think a lot of them are being ignored because, well, they're not very exciting. I mean, if you've got people who, you know, most people who go to Rome as tourists are there for 2 to 4 days, maybe only 1 day, and they're going to hit the greatest hits, and a chunk of wall in a traffic circle is not going to be the greatest hits. So I'd say, like, in sort of purely like practical terms, there wouldn't be a huge amount of incentive to highlight these. Most of them don't have any signage, so even if you happen to walk past it, you're not going to know what it is. And so Rome is so full of monuments. There are bits of stuff everywhere. There's more than anybody. I mean, okay, I'm not gonna say there's more than anybody could ever see, but there's more than most of us could ever see. And I think they're just, you gotta make some choices, and chunks of old wall are never gonna be very exciting. The train station one, I read this fascinating book recently about the history of Termini train station, which basically the walls have gone in and out of being fashionable at the train station. Currently, whoever is in charge of the train station is more interested in using that space for having a shop than for a observation deck. So again, probably practicalities. They've never entirely known what to do with those walls. The reason the walls are there and we can see them, not the reason they're there, but the reason we can see them is actually from when that area got dug up in the 19th century to build the train station. The walls were almost destroyed. There was a strong part of the people who were in charge of the train station building who were just like, get rid of them, they're in the way. So there's this constant pull between the needs of the modern city and the needs of the ancient city, and though Termini walls are part of that history.
Thanks, Melanie. Yeah, it's interesting to think about the kind of reductive vision of antiquity that the modern tourist might get by going to different places with this short visit and the big buildings, and you get the kind of the glory that was Greece and the grandeur that was Rome, but you don't get into the nitty gritty of daily life and the lived experience of individuals. So in that sense, sort of your project, and especially if there's a kind of public aspect to it, can really bring that out for people who only have 3 days and want to see the Colosseum and the Forum, but then they can take a look at what you produce to get a sense of maybe some of the more I think you said humble ruins. I think I wrote that down, the humble ruins of Rome. Our next question is from our friend Alison Keith at the University of Toronto. Do we know of any occasions when Cicero walked the Appian Way or talked about the Serbian Walls? It sounds like Professor Keith is asking you, do we know of any times when Cicero was Melanie Racette-Campbell?
Cicero wishes, or I'm not sure about the Serbian Walls, but he definitely mentions the Porta Capana, which means he's definitely has been on the Appian Way. So I would say yes for the Appian Way, probably no for the Serbian Walls. That's one of the things that will be useful for me to find out when I actually kind of make my list of places to investigate. If some of them I've already been to, that's great, because I've already got part of that mental map, as I keep saying. So that'll be something I have to investigate.
Sort of following off on this thought about the types of ruins that make up the tourist experience of Rome. Another one of our audience members asked, would you recommend this trip to someone who's not a history and classics major? Is this, is the kind of stuff you're interested in only for history buffs, or what do you think? All
right, I would not recommend walking around and finding all the pieces of the Serbian Walls to anybody who's not even to, like, I wouldn't recommend it to most history and classics majors unless you are specifically curious to find the wall pieces. Do you really need to look in an alley behind garbage cans with some of your precious time in Rome? Probably not. The Park of the Via Appia, though, 100% I recommend it. If you are in Rome with more than, let's say if you're there for 3 days, you probably don't need to see the park. If you're there for more than 3 days, it's a gorgeous way to spend a day. It gets you to see some different things and to experience Rome in a different way. There are a bunch of different museums. There are catacombs if you're interested in that kind of thing. There's simply empty, open space where you can have a picnic. As I said, you can rent a bike. There are restaurants. It's a really good way to get a different view of Rome than you're going to get in the city center. So the park part, yes, 100% recommend to people.
And I think you said it when you were talking about that. It also gives us the true sense that the ancient world is mostly rural, right? We focus on the urban settings, and obviously, as you pointed out, the literature takes us there. But that so much of the lived experience of people in antiquity would have been rural, and the proximity of the rural to the city that you also highlighted, that I thought is particularly valuable from your approach to this, to sort of see how close are these things actually, is different than, for myself, but different for a lot of people in the modern Western world, right? Who have this straight distinction between rural and urban. Our friend right here, Michael McGinnon, our colleague, asks the next question. How might power factor into the concept of male and female space? Thus, might a powerful woman have more access to male space and vice versa for a weaker male?
First answer is to the second question. Yes, to some extent. Power definitely factors in. Would a powerful woman have more access to male space? To some extent, although always with risks involved. So powerful women could have access to the less formal parts of male space. They didn't have access to formal political structures, like they couldn't speak in the Senate, for instance. They couldn't speak for somebody else in a law court, although they could speak on their own behalf. So those spaces were quite limited to them, but they were able to enter the space of places where political backroom dealing was happening. Women could access that if they were powerful, although always with risks. So this woman, the speech that I mentioned, where there's, that Cicero is using a woman's house against her, basically, this was a powerful woman. And the fact that she was powerful and the fact that she did kind of transgress into male space also left her open to criticism and was risky for her. So as for weaker men having access to female space or having less access to male space?
Guess it. What did Michael's question? Might a powerful woman have more access to male space and vice versa for a weaker male? So might a weaker male have access, I suppose, to female space? But either one, I think you're around the theme of the question.
I mean, a weaker man would certainly have less access to certain kinds of male space. Would he have more access to female space? Maybe, but he would risk losing his masculinity altogether if he spent too much time there, especially if, like, during certain occasions. A really famous example of a male transgressing into female space also is related to Cicero, and actually is also related to the woman that I was just mentioning. Her brother, whose name was Claudius, he transgressed into female space. He very kind of famously transgressed into female space. There was a certain kind of religious ceremony to a goddess called Bonadea, which was strictly women's only space. And this man, Claudius, dressed himself as a woman so he could sneak into this space, allegedly because he was having an affair with somebody in there, I think was the reason. And it caused him problems. It kind of called his masculinity in question, as well as being an offense to the gods. So it's risky either way for somebody to go into space that isn't the space that matches the gender that they're supposed to be performing.
Yeah, it makes me think as a Hellenist of the Bacchae. Dangers of, real dangers there of going into feminine space. Our next question is from Dr. Whately. A wonderful talk, he says. Lots of questions, but he's going to ask this one, which he characterizes as perhaps silly. So I know you're going to focus on Cicero and how he genders space in Rome. As you get into this project, do you think how he genders space will differ quite a lot from contemporaries? That is, are others likely to gender spaces in quite a different way? Is it very personal?
All right, so I'm going to try and arrange my thoughts here of how I would answer this. So to some extent, I imagine it's personal, but one advantage of Cicero's writing is that we do have this wide variety of genres, and in at least some of the writing he's doing, especially the stuff that's meant to appeal to a jury or a judge or the Senate in general, he's likely to be quite conventional. He's going to want to be presenting things in a way that he thinks is going to make sense to others. And as it does it differ from his contemporaries? Well, I think the answer to that is we can't know, because we just don't have enough information from the contemporaries to develop as nuanced a picture for anybody except Cicero. I suspect that Cicero will be, even if we had other people's work, I suspect that in Cicero's it will be more transparent, like what his thought process are and how he's thinking of gender and space, because Cicero wasn't born into the Roman political establishment. He was a bit of an outsider, and this means that stuff that would be natural to somebody who had been born into that society, Cicero has to think about it a little bit more, and Cicero is a little more aware of the workings and how it's supposed to go. So yeah, I hope that answers the question. I think that's all the thoughts I had on it.
Yeah, I think it's obviously that's one of the kind of questions you're going to pursue. So it's you know, good to see what we think. No, I didn't think it was a silly question either, Clara.
No, not at all.
Our next question is from Pauline Rapat here, our colleague Pauline. Will you be considering legal status as elements of gender as you consider the physical entity of the city? For example, do you think you might be able to see freedman masculinity as opposed to freeborn male masculinity in the physical components of the city as they appear through the lens of Cicero?
I will probably end up focusing primarily on freeborn men, purely because I think Cicero will have more to say about them. This is an issue of, you know, there just being less information on people who aren't from the elite politically active class. So I will probably end up focusing more on freeborn. However, if as I go through reading all of Cicero, I find, oh, actually, there is a significant amount of material here for freed people. Is there something different? That would be awesome. And I would certainly pursue it. I've also kind of already decided to narrow my focus to only Romans, and I will include provincial Italians in there. I don't want to look at people from outside of Italy. Partly because I suspect that the same rules would not apply, and even Cicero would know the same rules aren't going to apply to somebody who is a foreigner who's from the provinces. So yeah, status, maybe I expect the status I'm going to be looking at is purely freeborn people, but we'll see.
Do you have a sense, Melanie, if I can just interject with a question that just occurs from what you've just said? I'm thinking of Dr. McKinnon's question about the weaker men. Is there a sense that enslaved men had access to female spaces in a way that free men might not?
I mean, probably if their work took them into female spaces. Probably.
Yeah, so sort of gender and status, it's almost that they kind of become non-masculine in a way, perhaps, or a different masculinity.
Well, they're definitely non-masculine in the sense that, like, enslaved men simply couldn't access full adult male free masculinity. Because one of the central components of that kind of masculinity is being able to have control over your own body. And if you were enslaved, you, by definition, don't have that. So.
Yeah, okay.
But it also, yeah, it might mean that they had access to spaces that free men would not.
Well, thank you for that. I'll return to the questioners now, leave my own thoughts beside. The last question I think we have, unless someone's going to pop up with another one, comes from our colleague Victoria Austin. Do you have any thoughts on how a gendered sense of space intersects with different levels of publicity and privacy? This relates to some of what you've said already, I think.
My first thought is yes. So masculine gender, but also feminine gender, if we're talking about free people, I mean, it is very public. I mean, Roman gender it's a public performance in the kind of Butlerian sense, where if other people don't see you doing your gender and redoing it every day for the rest of your life, you don't even really have that gender. It's not internal. So definitely it's got this public relationship to it. And I think, like, kind of connecting back to what I was saying about realizing how kind of small Rome was, and just what we know about the way that Roman houses worked and such, privacy and the kind of the internal life doesn't seem as important for gender, if that makes sense. I think that's my answer to your question.
Yeah, I think that seems pretty reasonable. To this performance element and is such a critical element of ancient social mores altogether. So that works. We did have another question. I spoke too soon, so maybe this is the final question. We'll see. It's a big one from another member of our audience. What advice? This is someone who's been inspired. What advice would you give to an aspiring classicist?
What advice would I give to an aspiring classicist? Follow the things you're interested in. Probably other people will also be interested in them if you are. Be prepared for that like doing what you love might mean a lot of work for relatively little reward. But it can be worth it if it's what you really love. In sort of more practical advice, figure out a way for somebody else to pay to get you to Italy or Greece or wherever. There are all sorts of scholarships and awards out there that people can apply for. And if you are interested in them, you should definitely talk to your professors about how you can access that kind of stuff, because there are people who will pay. And because going to the places, it's such a different experience than reading about it.
Thanks. And I'll just add on from what Melanie said, if this is a University of Winnipeg student, talk to the chair of the department about your program and how we can make it work. So we're always happy to hear from aspiring classicists, of course. So I'm seeing no more questions, and well, no more questions that people want to put forward, though I'm sure, like the other people have a note page full of questions. I'm fortunate enough to have Dr. Racette-Campbell usually across the hall from me, so I can pester her as much as I wish. But I'm sure I'm not speaking out of turn to suggest that if people had further questions or follow-up comments, Melanie, you'd be happy to hear from them by email. And Dr. Racette-Campbell's contact information can be found at uwinnipeg.ca/classics, and just look at the faculty link. Before we go, it just leaves me to thank my colleagues here in the Department of Classics, the Faculty of Arts, for their financial support of our series. As I said, this talk has been recorded and will be available on our YouTube channel. I think I promised to put that in the chat, and now I've forgotten, so let me see if I can do it while talking. Our next talk, as I said, is going to be March 17th. We're hoping to have back-to-back talks by Max Goldman and Rebecca Kennedy, both from Denison University. Dr. Goldman's talk will also be on the built environment of the city of Rome, on the Eurysakes Monument, and new research on that archaeological monument. And Dr. Rebecca Kennedy's talk is entitled Classics, Indigeneity, and Modern Scientific Race. So if you'd like to hear, more about the details of when those talks happen, you can go to uwinnipeg.ca/classics and click on the link for new directions in classics. You can follow the University of Winnipeg on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram. We're not on TikTok. You can email me at pj.miller@uwinnipeg.ca, and I can email you a full poster and listing. And otherwise, it just leaves me to thank Dr. Racette-Campbell for this engaging talk that transported me, at least, away from Winnipeg for a moment to warm Rome, and brought to bear the real importance of getting out there and walking the walk before you do your talk, if I might end with a horrendous rhyme. And I'll thank also our audience members for coming, and wish you a happy